Tomorrow, the 20th of February, Mars and Saturn conjunct in the sign of Scorpio. If astrology is just rubbish to you, and you don't see any purpose in it, I would still say that we are facing a spring and a summer of turbulence. Not only will these planets align in the one sign for the duration of the spring and summer, but we are seeing an alignment of forces around the world that I personally predict will spell the end of a lot of our hardships, but not without hardships that we must pass through. Some say that the world economy won't survive another summer. Some say it will be this September that it all goes bang, because that's when it happens, in Septembers. And from what we can see, World War III, as I've been predicting for months on the anti-broadcast, is getting ready to happen. You have amassed hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of troops and other military equipment in the north of Saudi Arabia. Syrian officials have said that Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and America can't bear to see Syria and Russia winning against the terrorists. I think this is a fair assessment. Russia is due to sell $8 billion worth of military equipment to China. The East is gearing up for a massive war, with the Levant being the center stage, as opposed to former world wars where Germany was the center stage. We see millions and millions of immigrants, or invaders, however you like to see them, pouring into Europe, and that will only intensify. As war breaks out, then we won't be joking around anymore, like we have been for the last year. We're due to see more. It will come to a crunch time as far as I'm concerned. We're starting to see the tides turn in Europe. Angela Merkel gets booed when she's out in public. She's hated. And so are the other cucking politicians. We don't see this yet because, well, myself and my friends are so fixated on the leftist opposition to our common sense arguments against unlimited immigration that they are missing that Europe is actually changing. Although the electoral European right is basically useless, they're going to have to respond to our demands and shut the doors to immigration, and they will have popular support. Because despite the radical left response, or reaction, most people deep down in their hearts and in their critical centers know that unlimited immigration is unsustainable, and a lot of the immigration that has occurred must be reversed. In this year of 2016, most of our ways of life face extinction. And it's not all written in the stars. It's not all cold, hard fate that we can't change. We can learn from the past. And specifically when it comes to Europe, we can learn from the likes of Weimar Germany or the Roman Empire. Strangely enough, the conditions that exist in many places in the European Union now very, very eerily reflect the conditions of Weimar Germany and the collapsing Roman Empire. To illustrate, I will read from this fantastic book, Generation Identity, chapter 23, on the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. As the Visigoths crossed the Danube in 376 and penetrated the borders of the Eastern Roman Empire, Emperor Valens was facing a fateful decision. His generals pleaded with him to gather the army and force back the Goths. His political advisors, however, feared a long and bitter war. In their view, the Visigoths were only defenseless refugees displaced by the Huns. They convinced Valens that he must show compassion and assign the Goths land in the Roman Empire. The empire had far too few soldiers, so it might be quite clever to win the Visigoths as allies. What was wrong with taking them in? In 50 years, so they thought, the Visigoths would be civilized Roman citizens like all the rest. Only their unusual pale skin and blonde hair would remain as reminders that they came from outside. So they gave Visigoths land. Some years went by, and the Romans congratulated themselves on their brilliant solution to the problem. They drank their wine and let the Visigoths fight for them. Yet the Visigoths did not by any means integrate themselves into Roman society, but became a state within a state. Over the course of the following years, even more Germanic peoples crossed the Danube and joined the Visigoths. The power of the tribe became so mighty that it no longer followed the emperor's orders. When Emperor Valens recognized that the Visigoths had grown out of his control, he sent his army to subdue them. But there were already far too many of them. The Romans underestimated the power of the Visigoths and were defeated. Therefore, fleeing from the Huns, the tribe murdered and pillaged its way through the Roman Empire. In 410, they sacked Rome and finally settled in Gaul. The Huns were now a Western Roman problem. After having recovered their strength and won a victory over the Goths, the Romans once again faced the question: should we continue to attack and drive them back to Germania, or ally ourselves with them? Fearing a long war, the Roman politicians sent the Goths enormous quantities of gold to win them as allies against the Huns. When the Hunnic Empire finally collapsed after Attila's death, the Roman treasury was bare. The countryside had been ravaged or occupied by the Visigoths and other Germanic tribes. Money for new soldiers was lacking, and although the external threat from the Huns had been eliminated, the empire was still doomed to fail. Vandals, Ilmani, and Visigoth were finally established within the empire and could no longer be removed. The Romans sent them gold to purchase peace, but at some point their reserve ran out. Then the Germanic tribes finally declared independence from Rome and laid waste to the rest of the Western Empire. In 476, the last emperor of Rome was dethroned. The fall of the Roman Empire is similar to the process now underway in Europe. Will we one day speak of the decline and fall of the West? Devastated and weakened by the Second World War, allegedly clever European politicians sought help from outside. The borders were opened to millions of Muslims, intended to breathe new life into a Europe with a declining birth rate and allow Europe to compete economically with the USA and the Soviet Union, and later with the rising powers of China and India. The Muslims, however, didn't integrate themselves, but formed parallel societies. They had significantly more children than the Europeans. Their numbers grew without pause through new births and continued immigration. The politicians sought to keep them quiet with payoffs from the welfare state, but in the course of an overwhelming economic crisis, their savings gave out. Europe had to start making cuts, and so unrest began among the immigrants, first in 2005 in Paris, then in 2011 starting in London, and spreading across England. The number of Muslims continued to grow, and at a certain point they began to dominate the state and civil society. When the Europeans finally attempted to rise up against them, their rebellion was suppressed. The Europeans, having grown old and weak, had nothing with which they could oppose the young and strong Muslims. Western civilization dissolved, and new Muslim empires emerged in its former territory. We can still prevent this future. We can still bring about a change of events, yet we can only do this if we honestly and pitilessly admit to ourselves what sort of a situation we are actually in. We have the courage to do this. With the example of the Romans before us, we know that we will need to fight for our identity. Europe's fate is not yet sealed, but we ourselves will write our history, for we are Generation Identity.